Well, we're in lesson 10 in the book of Job, and we're in chapters 40 and 41. In the previous section, chapter 38 and 39, God had finally spoken. And he enters in precisely the same way as he enters here for the second time in verse 6 of chapter 40. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said. Now, we didn't point this out in our previous lesson, but when God does finally speak, you do notice how he comes in a whirlwind. God has been silent. It's been part of the problem that Job has had to face. God hasn't spoken. He hasn't answered Job's questions. You'd think that to a man who's lost everything and is at death's door, that God would come as he did to Elijah in a still, small voice. But instead, he comes in a whirlwind. It's meant, I think, to convey that God is different from the way that we might expect him to be. Now, in this second appearance in chapter 40, we're introduced to two characters, two entities. One is in verse 15 of chapter 40, behold, Behemot. We'll talk about him in a minute. And then in the first verse of chapter 41, we're introduced to another, Leviathan. Behemoth and Leviathan. It's a battle about words. It's a battle about ideas. It's a battle about epistemology. It's a battle about wisdom, the meaning of life, the explanation for pain and suffering. God has already reduced Job to silence by asking him a series of questions, 65 questions, about ore and gemstones in the earth, about birds and fish and weather-related issues, about the stars and the universe and so on, none of which Job could answer. Job has been reduced to silence. But he hasn't been reduced enough. So God comes to him again. He needs to understand something, well, about the very nature and character of God himself. So let's pick up verse 15. Behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs like bars of iron, and so on. Who or what is Behemoth? Behemoth is a land creature of some kind. It's in the plural. It's literally beast, but it's in the plural, an intensification of the idea of beast. And while you're pondering who Behemoth is, let's drop down to verse 1 of chapter 41, and we have Leviathan, a sea monster. In the Greek translation, the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, Leviathan is translated as a dragon. Now, who or what are they? Leviathan, can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose and pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever, and so on? One is a land creature, one is a sea creature. Now, there are those who identify Behemoth and Leviathan with actual animals that existed in between creation and the flood, prehistoric creatures like T-Rex. This is a land a dinosaur of some kind, and the other is a sea creature, a huge creature, perhaps extinct now. And there are those who believe, for example, in a view of creation and the flood, catastrophism, that the explanation for fossil records and so on lies in global flood, and that explains the extinction of the species and so on. And Leviathan would be pterosaur, and Behemoth would be brontosaurus. There are those who identify the creatures in that way. Then in the Renaissance period, we're talking 14th century or so, there was a movement to identify these creatures as actual creatures. Behemoth is a known word in English literature, in Renaissance and post-Renaissance literature, identifiable as an elephant. So Behemoth is an elephant. More recently, it's been identified as a hippopotamus, perhaps. Now, you can read the description from verse 15 to verse 24. Does it fully match the description either of an elephant or, let's go for now, with a hippopotamus? And the answer is no, not really. There's some poetry here. There's some exaggeration here. This is not a detailed description of a hippopotamus. A leviathan, similarly, a crocodile. So you've got an interpretation that says one is a hippopotamus, the other is a crocodile. Well, let's go with that for now. Now, there are other interpretations, that identify Behemoth and Leviathan, particularly perhaps in light of the use of such animals in ancient Near Eastern literature, contemporaneous with the authorship of the book of Job, that identify these creatures with the demonic. The question is asked in the book of Job, whatever happened to Satan? He appears at the beginning of the book, he never appears again. He doesn't appear. You might expect the explanation for suffering given to Job as Satan. After all, we're given that explanation at the beginning, that Satan has a part to play. He's not the total explanation, but he has a part to play in suffering and pain. But there's no mention of Satan in the closing chapters of Job. And there is an argument, and many contemporary interpretations of Job identify Behemoth and Leviathan with the demonic. And that what is being said here is that the demonic is part of the explanation for why, in general terms, there is suffering in the world. I'm not convinced that would be the explanation that Job himself would have understood simply from what is written here. It takes a degree of research to get at that point, and I'm just doubtful that Job himself would have understood that. So I've always been drawn to the view that Behemoth and Leviathan are perhaps a hippopotamus and a crocodile. And Klein's, for example, who has written a massive 3-volumed contemporary commentary on the book of Job, probably the biggest, largest commentary on the book of Job in ever, but certainly in the last 100 years. And he is by far and away the expert as far as the Hebrew of the book of Job is concerned. And I was fascinated to see when he finally published his 3rd and final volume, that he also came down on the view that Behemoth and Leviathan were a hippopotamus and a crocodile. Well, let's think about that for a minute. A hippopotamus and a crocodile. So God comes to you, you're suffering, you've experienced this enormous tragedy, this enormous difficulty in your life, and God says to you, did you ever think about a hippopotamus? And you want to say, really? What in the world does a hippopotamus have to do with anything, let alone pain and suffering? Or a crocodile? Or, since we're in Florida, an alligator? I was preaching a dozen years or so ago in Tallahassee, Florida. I remember the occasion vividly. And I was preaching on this passage, the closing chapters of Job 38. And I made the point, as I'm making the point now, that perhaps Leviathan is an alligator. And I said, without thinking of where I was, I said, I couldn't care less if there weren't any gators in the world tomorrow. And there was a response in the congregation, and some were very positive, and some were decidedly of the opposite opinion. And I wasn't privy to all of the nuances of Floridian football to understand what it was I had just said. But let's ask the question, why would God make a hippopotamus? Why did he create a hippopotamus? They're one of the most dangerous creatures in the world. Many, many people have been killed by a hippopotamus in Africa. Have you ever looked at a hippopotamus up close and personal? It looks like something a committee would make. It's all out of proportion. You know, these bulbous legs, and they're quite short, and that ridiculous little tail, and the head, you know. Why? Or a crocodile. Why did God make crocodiles? I asked this question one time of a friend. Why did God make crocodiles? Handbags, he said. Shoes. You know, if I were to be honest, I've given money, not a lot, but I've given a few dollars to save the polar bear. I would be sorry, but this is not a political statement, but I would be sorry if there were no polar bears in the world. That would be a tragedy. Imagine a world without polar bears. And given what's happening to the climate, and again, this is not a political statement, given what's happening to the climate and so on, the polar bears are having a rough time of it. I couldn't care less if there were no crocodiles in the world. If we were to wake up tomorrow and some organization was trying to collect money to save the crocodiles, they wouldn't get a dime from me. Why would God make a crocodile? You've perhaps watched a movie on YouTube in the Serengeti or somewhere, and there are crocodiles and there are wildebeests, and they're coming down and they're drinking at this little pond that's shrinking in the heat and so on, and you know what's going to happen. This crocodile's going to come and slap its jaws around this wildebeest's head or its little calf or something. There are lots of these movies, and they're riveting. And every single one of you is on the side of the wildebeest. Right? No one is cheering on for the crocodile. There's something wrong with you if you're cheering for the crocodile. So, why did God make a crocodile? What's going on here? Why is God introducing Behemoth and Leviathan? What in the world has this got to do with anything? But what has it got to do with pain? Well, as Derek Kidner says in his commentary on Job, what is the reason why God made a hippopotamus? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know. I have no idea. And pain is like that. Why does God send pain? I don't know. I really don't know. I don't have an answer. Why does a righteous person suffer? Why are some people born with horrible maladies, our special needs, children whom we love, and often I think are angels sent to test us. Why? I don't know. I really don't know. And pain is like that. It's not important that you know. What's important is that he knows. Well, let's go back to the question again. Why did God create a crocodile? What's the answer? The answer is, as every good catechized child knows, God created a crocodile for his own glory. For his own glory. Why is there pain in the world? For his own glory. Yes, through pain, through suffering, God is going to be glorified. Just think of one small aspect of it in terms of, well, it's not a small aspect. It's the Lord Jesus. God is glorified in the sending of the Lord Jesus. If there was no pain, if there was no suffering, if there was no need whatsoever, why would Jesus have ever come? And the fact that he has come and the fact that he has died, demonstrating to us something of the very heart of the love and mercy of the Lord. There's a connection here. God is glorified even through this pain. It was you who did it, Peter said on the day of Pentecost, who took him and slew him. But it was all by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. There's something else in this passage, and that is that some have seen here in Behemot and Leviathan, and let me expand on this just a little bit more, that Behemot and Leviathan are not real creatures, perhaps. There's a possibility. They're mythological creatures. They were creatures that would have meant something significant in the ancient Near East. And perhaps they're imaginary creatures. Imaginary things can have a great effect upon us. And one thinks, for example, in Egypt, for example, in the Egyptian background, Seti, the god of darkness, and Horus, the god of light, and they were creatures. And in Canaanite mythology, the god of death lurks in marshlands, very similar to the description given of where Leviathan, for example, is described to be. Creatures that, at least in people's imagination, have powers of life and death and powers to inflict pain. So there are those who interpret this passage by saying that what is taking place here is that Behemoth and Leviathan are being mentioned. Think of your worst imagination, your worst nightmare. Well, perhaps some of you might remember in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Edmund and the Dark Island and so on, and he imagines the Kraken. Remember the great sea monster? And he imagines it, and it comes into being and threatens to drown them and take their lives and so on. Well, perhaps what's taking place here is that God is in control. God is superior. God is more powerful than the worst creatures that you could ever imagine. Maybe that's what it is. That's not where I would end up interpreting this passage, but there are those, and there are quite a number of them, who would interpret the passage in that way. And then there's something else that we should see here. There's the fact that God is coming to Job. He's a man who's experienced the most horrendous of trials. He's lost his children. He's lost his wealth. He's lost his health. And God is coming to him and saying, did you ever think about Behemoth? Did you ever think about Leviathan? Why do they exist? And the answer is, I don't know. Except I know this, they exist to glorify God. It's not important that I understand. What's important is that he understands, that he knows his purpose, his plan. Well, that's where Job has to be brought. It's not enough for him simply to be silent. It's not enough for him, as in the first part of this closing section, it's not enough for him simply to put his hand upon his mouth and say, I will say no more. He needs to confess. He needs to exercise faith. He needs to trust. He needs to bow down before this sovereign God and allow this God to rule and reign over every aspect of his life, even the dark things. We know, Paul says in Romans chapter 8, we know that all things work together for good, or perhaps in a different translation, we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him. It's not just that things work together for good by some inherent power within themselves. That's not an adequate theodicy. That's not an adequate explanation for the existence of evil. What we need to do is, what we need to say, and what we need to confess is, God so orders all things. And the origin of sin lies outside of the direct causation of God. God is not the author of sin. Sin has been allowed to enter into the universe. The Bible doesn't give us much by way of an explanation for that. Sin was in the universe before Adam and Eve. Satan was in existence. There had already been a rebellion in heaven. A third of the angels had rebelled. And all of that is clouded in some mystery for us. We're not given an explanation for that. But as far as your particular pain, your particular suffering, your particular trial is concerned, and you come before God and you say, why? Why me? Why now? Why so intense? And there may be no answer that can be given. All the counselors in the world cannot give you an explanation for it. But you take it to him. And you say, I know that you know. And I trust you. How can I trust him? How can I trust God? Does he send this evil thing into the world? Does he so control the world in a whimsical fashion? No. He is the God who sends his Son. What kind of God is he? He's the God who sends his Son. He's the God who has loved us from before the foundation of the world. I go to him with the gospel in my hands. And I understand that Christ has died for my sins and risen again for my justification. I can trust him. I can trust him with my sin. I can trust him with my life. I can trust him with my difficulties. I can trust him with my pain. I can trust him with my sorrow. I can trust him with my hurt. Well, that's not the only message of the book of Job. And we've got one more lesson. It's the wonderful way in which this book ends in chapter 42. It's a beautiful ending. And we'll consider it together in our next lesson.